Welcome to EconWars. Tonight, we explore the life of Benjamin Franklin, one of the most influential financial minds in American history. This is not only a biography, but a journey through the financial history of colonial America, where trade, printing, labor, and information slowly shaped the foundations of modern finance. As an independent financial historian, I'll guide you through the quieter systems behind wealth, influence, and the early American economy, one story at a time. This is where history meets finance, where money explained itself slowly through human behavior, survival, commerce, and trust. And long before Benjamin Franklin became a founding father of the United States, he was simply a young boy trying to understand how the world around him truly worked.
Before money became numbers on a screen, or paper stored in banks, it began as something far quieter. A reputation. A skill. A habit repeated carefully over time. In small rooms lit only by candlelight, systems were already being built. Not through force or inheritance, but through patience, consistency, and trust. He was not born into wealth, or power, or privilege. But he understood something many wealthy men of his time never fully did, that information itself could become a form of currency. The systems that shape economies rarely begin in palaces or government halls. More often, they begin quietly, inside ordinary lives that learn how value truly works. And long before America had a financial identity of its own, Benjamin Franklin was already learning how systems of trust, labor, and information could quietly shape the future. Benjamin Franklin was born in January of 1706, in the growing colonial city of Boston. His family was large, his surroundings modest, and his early life shaped not by luxury, but by constant activity, labor, and limited space. His father worked as a candle maker, producing soap and candles by hand in a world still lit by fire. The household was crowded with children, responsibilities, and routines that repeated from morning until night. Candles were not symbols of comfort during this period. They were necessities. Every home, workshop, and street depended on them once daylight disappeared. Franklin watched his father work carefully and repeatedly, transforming raw material into something useful through patience and routine. Although he would eventually leave this trade behind, the rhythm of that work stayed with him for the rest of his life. Benjamin's father worked long hours producing candles and soap by hand. It was repetitive work, practical work, the kind of labor that rarely made a man wealthy, but often kept a family alive. In the evenings, the workshop carried the scent of smoke, melted wax, and damp wood. Young Benjamin spent years surrounded by these routines, quietly observing how small tasks repeated consistently could sustain an entire household. Long before he understood politics or economics, he was already learning something simpler, and perhaps more important. Value was created slowly. Books quickly became one of the few things that truly captured Benjamin's attention. The Franklin household did not possess great wealth, but whenever he found access to reading material, he consumed it with unusual intensity. In quiet moments after work had ended, he often sat near the fading warmth of the fire, reading slowly by candlelight while the rest of the home settled into silence. The ideas inside those pages began expanding his world far beyond the narrow streets of colonial Boston. Boston during the early 1700s was still a hard and practical place to live. Most families worked constantly, and opportunities for advancement were limited. Benjamin moved through these streets as a young boy surrounded by merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and laborers, quietly observing how trade and survival shaped everyday life. Long before he entered politics or became internationally known, he was already studying the systems that allowed cities, and the people inside them, to function. As Benjamin grew older, he became increasingly drawn toward the world of printing. Compared to candle making, a print shop felt different. It was louder in some ways, but intellectually alive. Newspapers, pamphlets, essays, and political arguments moved constantly through these spaces, carrying information between merchants, workers, and entire colonies. For a curious young boy already fascinated by reading, the printing trade offered something far more valuable than simple labor. It offered access to ideas. Printing required patience and precision. Every letter had to be arranged by hand, every page assembled carefully before ink ever touched the paper. The work could be repetitive and physically exhausting, but Benjamin adapted to it quickly. More importantly, the workshop exposed him to a constant flow of information. In many ways, these early years inside the print shop became his true education. Boston's harbor connected the colonies to a much larger world. Ships arrived carrying paper, tools, cloth, tea, sugar, and information from across the Atlantic. For young Benjamin, the docks became another classroom. Merchants negotiated prices beside crates of imported goods while sailors exchanged rumors, news, and political arguments from distant cities. Trade was not an abstract idea here. It was something visible, something alive, shaping the rhythm of the entire colony.
By his teenage years, Benjamin had already begun experimenting with writing. Sometimes he stayed awake long after the household had gone quiet, practicing essays and arguments by candlelight. He studied the structure of other writers carefully, copying passages by hand and rewriting them in his own words. Without realizing it fully, he was training himself to communicate clearly, a skill that would eventually become one of the greatest sources of his influence. By the time Benjamin entered his teenage years, printing had already become far more than a trade to him. Inside these workshops, information moved constantly between merchants, politicians, writers, and ordinary citizens. Newspapers carried arguments about taxes, trade, religion, and the future of colonial America itself. Long before modern finance explained the power of information networks, Franklin was already witnessing how ideas could shape economies, influence public behavior, and quietly alter the direction of history. The colonies of early America were deeply connected through printed information. Essays, pamphlets, newspapers, and political arguments traveled from city to city long before telephones or modern communication existed. Franklin quickly understood that printing was not merely about ink and paper. It was about influence. Whoever controlled information often shaped how people understood money, authority, and power itself. Printing demanded discipline. The work often began before sunrise and continued long after darkness settled across the city. Pages had to be assembled carefully by hand, every letter placed with precision before ink touched the paper. For young Benjamin Franklin, these routines quietly shaped the habits that would define much of his later success. Consistency, repetition, and careful attention to detail became part of his daily life long before he became known as a writer, inventor, or founding father. Franklin's education was never formal in the way many wealthy families might have expected. Much of what he learned came from observation, repetition, reading, and conversation. He borrowed books whenever possible and studied the writing styles of respected authors carefully, often rewriting essays in his own words simply to understand how strong arguments were constructed. Over time, he developed not only a love for ideas, but an understanding of how language itself could influence people. Taverns and coffee houses during the colonial period were more than places for food and drink. They functioned as informal centers of information, where merchants discussed trade routes, sailors exchanged foreign news, and printers circulated political ideas between cities. Benjamin listened carefully inside rooms like these. Long before he entered public life himself, he was quietly studying how information moved through society and how influence often belonged to those who controlled its flow. As he grew older, Franklin became increasingly aware that knowledge itself carried value. A skilled printer could distribute ideas across entire cities. A persuasive writer could shape public opinion. And a trusted publisher could slowly build influence without ever holding political office. These lessons would remain with him throughout his life, forming the foundation of how he understood wealth, communication, and power in the growing American colonies. Printing gave Franklin access to something rare for his time. Information arrived daily from merchants, politicians, sailors, and writers spread across the Atlantic world. Through newspapers and pamphlets, he observed how economic fear could influence behavior just as powerfully as physical force. Rumors affected trade. Shortages altered prices. Political arguments shaped public trust. Long before finance explained these systems formally, Franklin was already witnessing them unfold in real time. By his mid-teenage years, Benjamin Franklin had begun to see the colonies differently from many people around him. He no longer viewed Boston simply as a city of workshops and crowded streets. He saw networks, trade routes, systems of labor and exchange connecting ordinary people across vast distances. The movement of ships through the harbor carried more than cargo alone. They carried information, opportunity, and the early foundations of an emerging economy. Franklin's growing interest in writing eventually pushed him beyond simple observation. As a teenager, he began composing essays of his own, quietly slipping them into places where they might be discovered and printed. At first, his identity remained hidden. He understood that ideas often carried more power when judged independently from the person who created them. Even at a young age, Franklin was beginning to recognize how reputation, anonymity, and public trust could shape influence inside society. He studied writing with unusual discipline. Franklin often copied essays written by respected authors, then rewrote them entirely from memory to test whether he could reconstruct the same ideas with equal clarity. It was a slow and repetitive process, but one that sharpened both his thinking and communication. Over time, he learned that influence did not always belong to the loudest voice in a room. More often, it belonged to the person capable of expressing complex ideas simply and clearly. Despite his growing curiosity and intellectual ambition, Franklin's world remained modest. His family still lived carefully, balancing daily expenses against uncertain income like countless other households throughout colonial America. These early experiences left a lasting impression on him. Wealth, he realized, was not simply about possession. It was connected to stability, discipline, reputation, and the ability to adapt when circumstances changed. The harbor taught Franklin another important lesson. Trade depended on trust as much as goods themselves. Merchants relied on reputation, promises, and information moving accurately between cities and ports. A damaged reputation could destroy business relationships just as quickly as financial loss. Years later, Franklin would carry this understanding into politics, diplomacy, publishing, and finance, recognizing that trust itself was one of the most valuable currencies in the world. Inside the print shop, Benjamin encountered far more than technical labor. Newspapers carried reports of changing markets, political disputes, shipping delays, and rising tensions between colonial governments and ordinary citizens. Every printed page reflected systems larger than any individual person. Slowly, Franklin began understanding that economies were not built only by kings or wealthy merchants. They were shaped daily by communication, labor, public trust, and the movement of information. By the late teenage years of his life, Franklin had already developed habits that separated him from many people around him. He observed carefully, read constantly, and paid close attention to how ideas moved between individuals and institutions. Without realizing it fully, he was training himself to think in systems rather than isolated events. That perspective would later become one of the defining strengths of his financial and political understanding. Many people around Franklin viewed printing simply as a profession. But for him, it gradually became something larger. Newspapers revealed how fear could spread through populations, how rumors affected commerce, and how governments attempted to influence public opinion through information itself. The more he observed these patterns, the more he understood that ideas could shape economies just as powerfully as gold or land. By the age of 17, Benjamin Franklin had already begun imagining a future beyond the limits of Boston. He admired intelligence, independence, and self-education far more than inherited status. The crowded streets around him had taught him discipline, but they had also revealed the limitations of the life he currently knew. Somewhere beyond the harbor, beyond the workshops and narrow colonial streets, he believed greater opportunities were waiting. In 1723, Franklin made the difficult decision to leave Boston behind. The city had shaped much of his early thinking, but it also carried growing tension between himself and his older brother James, whose print shop had become both a workplace and a source of conflict. Franklin wanted more independence than Boston seemed willing to offer. So before reaching adulthood, he quietly prepared to begin again somewhere else. Travel between colonial cities during this period was uncertain and uncomfortable. Voyages could be cold, dangerous, and unpredictable, especially for someone with limited money and few connections. Yet Franklin viewed the journey differently. To him, movement itself represented opportunity. Every port connected new markets, new conversations, and new systems of trade. Even before arriving in Philadelphia, he was already beginning to understand how mobility and information could reshape a person's future. When Franklin finally arrived in Philadelphia, he was tired, underdressed, and carrying very little money. One of the most famous images from this moment describes him walking through the unfamiliar streets with several loaves of bread tucked awkwardly beneath his arms. To most people nearby, he appeared ordinary, perhaps even unimpressive. But beneath that modest appearance was a young man already shaped by years of observation, discipline, and relentless curiosity. Philadelphia was different from Boston in many ways. The city felt more open, more commercially active, and filled with people from different trades and backgrounds. Merchants, printers, craftsmen, and dock workers moved constantly through its streets, creating an atmosphere driven by exchange and opportunity. For Franklin, the city represented far more than a fresh start. It was a living system of commerce, communication, and ambition, exactly the kind of environment his mind had already begun seeking. Franklin adapted quickly to Philadelphia's printing world. The city's expanding economy created constant demand for newspapers, pamphlets, advertisements, and official notices. Print shops functioned as both businesses and information hubs, connecting commerce, politics, and everyday colonial life. Franklin immediately recognized that printing was not merely technical labor. It was infrastructure. Whoever controlled the movement of information could quietly influence how entire communities understood trade, money, and public affairs. Philadelphia also gave Franklin something he valued deeply: access to new conversations and ideas. He spent much of his free time reading, studying, and observing the habits of successful merchants and intellectuals around him. While many young men sought quick wealth or status, Franklin became increasingly interested in systems that produced long-term stability. Discipline, reputation, useful knowledge, and reliable work mattered far more to him than appearances. Coffee houses and taverns in Philadelphia often served as informal centers of commerce and political discussion. Merchants exchanged shipping information, printers debated public opinion, and businessmen negotiated opportunities that could reshape entire careers. Franklin rarely entered these spaces as the loudest voice in the room. Instead, he listened carefully. Observation remained one of his greatest strengths. By studying how experienced men handled trade, communication, and reputation, he continued building the foundations of his own financial understanding. Franklin's progress during these years did not come from sudden success. It came through routine. He worked long hours, improved his technical skills, expanded his reading, and slowly earned the trust of people around him. While others chased quick advantage, Franklin focused on becoming consistently useful. That mindset would eventually separate him from many ambitious men of his generation. Philadelphia exposed Franklin to a wider economic world than he had known in Boston. Imported goods moved constantly through the city: paper, cloth, tools, sugar, tea, and tobacco, connecting ordinary colonial streets to international systems of trade. Wealth flowed unevenly through these networks. Some merchants accumulated influence rapidly while laborers struggled simply to survive. Franklin observed both worlds carefully, studying not only how money moved, but how society itself organized around it. Printing also brought Franklin into contact with merchants, traders, and businessmen whose decisions shaped the economy of the colonies. Inside counting houses like these, prices were negotiated, cargo routes planned, and financial risks carefully discussed long before modern banking systems existed in America. Franklin paid close attention to how successful merchants behaved. Many of them valued reliability and information more than outward displays of wealth. Reputation, consistency, and trust often determined who prospered and who quietly disappeared from the market. By the 1720s, Philadelphia was expanding rapidly as a center of colonial commerce. Warehouses filled with imported goods lined the streets near the harbor, while printers, merchants, craftsmen, and laborers all depended on one another through increasingly complex systems of exchange. Franklin began understanding that economies were not abstract forces controlled from afar. They were living networks built from thousands of ordinary interactions repeated every day across cities like this one. Philadelphia also revealed another side of colonial society to Franklin. Behind the crowded streets and workshops existed a smaller world of merchants and property owners whose wealth granted them influence far beyond ordinary citizens. Their homes were warmer, quieter, and filled with imported goods that most families could never afford. Franklin observed these differences carefully. He understood that financial systems shaped not only markets, but social hierarchy itself. As Franklin settled further into life in Philadelphia, he became increasingly drawn toward groups centered around discussion, education, and self-improvement. Unlike many men of his time, Franklin believed useful knowledge should not belong only to the wealthy or formally educated. He admired practical intelligence, the kind developed through reading, observation, discipline, and conversation. In rooms like these, ideas moved freely between printers, craftsmen, merchants, and apprentices, creating informal networks of learning that quietly shaped the culture of the growing colonies. Franklin listened carefully during these gatherings, but he also began participating more confidently. Years spent studying essays, observing business relationships, and working inside print shops had sharpened both his communication and his understanding of human behavior. He noticed how successful individuals presented themselves calmly, avoided unnecessary conflict, and built influence gradually through reliability rather than force. These lessons would eventually become central not only to his personal success, but to the broader financial and political systems he later helped influence across early America. During the early 18th century, printed information was becoming one of the most powerful forces in colonial society. Newspapers shaped public opinion, pamphlets influenced political debate, and printed advertisements connected buyers and sellers across expanding urban markets. Franklin understood that information itself possessed economic value. A trusted printer could influence how people thought about trade, government, religion, and even money itself. This realization deeply affected the way he approached his work. Franklin no longer viewed printing as simple labor performed for wages alone. He began seeing it as a gateway into larger systems of influence and commerce. Every newspaper distributed across the city carried ideas capable of shaping decisions made by merchants, families, political leaders, and ordinary workers alike. In many ways, Franklin was already developing an early understanding of what modern historians might describe as information economics, long before such language formally existed. Philadelphia's markets revealed another important truth to Franklin. Economies were not driven only by governments or wealthy elites. They depended on countless ordinary exchanges repeated every day between buyers, sellers, laborers, craftsmen, and merchants. Prices changed according to supply, demand, weather, transportation, trust, and rumor. A delayed shipment could affect entire neighborhoods. A successful harvest could stabilize prices across a region. Long before economics became a formal academic discipline, people throughout the colonies were already living inside complex systems shaped by incentives, scarcity, and information. Franklin paid attention to these patterns constantly. He observed which merchants earned trust, which businesses failed quietly, and how reputation often mattered as much as financial capital itself. These experiences slowly shaped his understanding of wealth, not as something static or inherited, but as a system built through discipline, usefulness, cooperation, and long-term credibility. Franklin believed that knowledge became most valuable when shared widely rather than guarded by a small elite. During this period of his life, he became increasingly interested in creating systems that allowed ordinary people greater access to useful information. Books, essays, newspapers, and public discussion all contributed to what Franklin viewed as practical education, an education shaped not only by schools, but by curiosity and disciplined self-improvement. These ideas eventually contributed to the formation of one of America's earliest subscription libraries, where members pooled resources together in order to purchase books collectively. To Franklin, this was not merely a cultural project. It reflected a deeper understanding of how cooperation could expand opportunity. Individuals with limited personal wealth could still gain access to knowledge if systems were designed intelligently. In many ways, Franklin approached information the same way successful merchants approached trade, through networks, shared resources, and long-term value creation. As Franklin gained more experience inside Philadelphia's printing industry, he also became increasingly disciplined in financial matters. Running a successful print operation required careful management of expenses, materials, labor, and customer relationships. Paper was expensive. Delayed payments could damage cash flow. Poor reputation could quietly destroy future business opportunities. Franklin studied these realities carefully and developed habits centered around thrift, reliability, and long-term planning. Unlike many people who associated wealth primarily with luxury or visible status, Franklin viewed financial stability as something quieter and more structural. To him, true prosperity depended on useful skills, strong reputation, disciplined spending, and the ability to remain valuable within a changing economy. These ideas would later shape many of the principles for which he became widely known throughout American history. Franklin never separated intellectual work entirely from physical labor. Even as his reputation slowly grew, daily life remained filled with practical responsibilities. Newspapers had to be delivered, materials protected from weather, equipment maintained, and customers managed consistently. This combination of physical work and intellectual ambition shaped Franklin's worldview in important ways. He admired usefulness more than appearance, efficiency more than luxury, and practical results more than empty status. These values connected closely to the economic realities of colonial America, where survival often depended on adaptability and disciplined work rather than inherited privilege alone. Franklin's experiences during these years helped form the foundation of a distinctly American vision of upward mobility, one rooted in self-improvement, productivity, and reputation rather than aristocratic birth. As Franklin's understanding of commerce expanded, he became increasingly fascinated by communication systems themselves. Information moved between colonies through letters, newspapers, shipping notices, and word carried physically across enormous distances. Delays could affect trade decisions, political coordination, and public trust. A city that received important news too late often paid for that delay economically. Franklin gradually recognized that communication networks functioned much like trade routes. Both relied on speed, reliability, and organization. In many ways, the colonies were beginning to form an early information economy, where those capable of distributing knowledge efficiently gained enormous influence. These observations would later shape Franklin's deep involvement with postal systems and public communication infrastructure throughout colonial America. Despite his growing ambitions, Franklin's personal finances remained limited during these years. Success arrived slowly, and daily life still required careful budgeting and restraint. He avoided unnecessary luxury whenever possible, preferring to invest time and resources into education, printing, and relationships that might provide long-term value. This disciplined approach distinguished him from many individuals who pursued status before stability. Franklin increasingly viewed money not as an end in itself, but as a tool capable of creating independence. Financial security meant freedom to think, write, experiment, and build institutions without constant dependence on wealthier patrons. This philosophy would remain central throughout much of his life and later influence broader American attitudes toward thrift, productivity, and self-made success. By his early 20s, Franklin had already begun developing a reputation inside Philadelphia as someone reliable, intelligent, and unusually disciplined. Reputation mattered enormously within colonial business culture. Credit systems often depended less on formal institutions and more on personal trust between merchants, printers, suppliers, and customers. A single damaged reputation could quietly destroy future opportunity. Franklin understood this instinctively. He worked carefully to present himself as dependable, useful, and financially responsible. These qualities helped him build relationships that later opened doors into larger networks of business, publishing, politics, and civic leadership. Long before he became internationally famous, Franklin was already building one of the most valuable forms of capital available in colonial America: credibility. Over time, Franklin moved steadily from apprentice labor toward business ownership and management. The transition was gradual rather than dramatic. Success in colonial America rarely arrived overnight, especially for someone without inherited wealth or powerful family connections. Franklin's progress came through patience, discipline, and his growing ability to organize both people and information effectively. Running a print business required balancing multiple systems at once. Supplies had to arrive on time. Customers expected reliable delivery. Apprentices required supervision. Political tensions could affect which publication succeeded and which created controversy. Franklin learned how small operational decisions often determined long-term stability. These experiences strengthened his belief that successful institutions depended less on charisma and more on structure, organization, and consistent execution. Franklin also became increasingly aware of how dependent colonial businesses were on international trade networks. Paper, books, printing equipment, and countless other materials often arrived from overseas markets connected through British shipping routes. Delays at sea, damaged cargo, or changes in trade policy could affect local economies across entire cities. Even relatively small businesses like print shops operated within much larger financial systems shaped by empire, transportation, and global commerce. These realities helped Franklin develop a broader understanding of economics than many people around him possessed. He understood that prosperity rarely existed in isolation. Local businesses depended on trade networks, communication systems, transportation infrastructure, and public trust all functioning together. Long before modern economists described interconnected markets formally, Franklin was already living inside one. Franklin's interest in systems extended far beyond business alone. He became deeply involved in discussions about science, philosophy, public organization, and civic improvement. What connected these interests was a consistent pattern in his thinking. Franklin believed societies functioned best when individuals cooperated intelligently, shared useful knowledge, and built institutions capable of improving everyday life. This perspective separated him from many political thinkers of his time. Franklin rarely approached problems through ideology alone. Instead, he focused on practical outcomes. Could communication move more efficiently? Could information become more accessible? Could institutions operate more reliably? Could ordinary citizens improve their conditions through discipline and cooperation? These questions gradually shaped not only Franklin's personal philosophy, but eventually the direction of early American civic and financial culture itself. As Franklin matured, he became increasingly aware that cities themselves functioned like living systems. Every workshop, dock, print shop, and market stall depended on countless other forms of labor operating quietly in the background. Bakers relied on shipping routes. Merchants relied on printers. Printers relied on paper imports and transportation networks. Even simple daily life depended on cooperation between thousands of individuals who would never fully know one another personally. This understanding deeply shaped Franklin's later views about economics and public organization. Prosperity, in his eyes, was rarely created through isolated genius alone. It emerged from systems that allowed information, trust, labor, and trade to circulate efficiently through society. Long before industrial capitalism transformed the modern world, Franklin was already recognizing the invisible structures holding economies together beneath the surface of ordinary life. Newspapers allowed Franklin to observe how quickly ideas could spread once communication networks became organized efficiently. Political arguments, trade news, financial rumors, and public debates traveled from colony to colony with increasing speed during this period. A printer capable of distributing information reliably held far more influence than many people realized. Franklin recognized that communication itself could shape economic behavior. Merchants adjusted prices based on incoming reports. Investors reacted to changing political conditions. Consumers altered purchasing habits according to rumors, shortages, and expectations about the future. Information was no longer passive. It actively influenced decisions throughout colonial society. In many ways, Franklin was witnessing the early foundations of what modern economies would eventually become, systems driven not only by goods and labor, but by the movement of information itself. Franklin also spent considerable time reflecting privately on discipline, habits, and personal conduct. He believed long-term success depended less on luck than on consistent behavior repeated over many years. Careful spending, useful work, honesty, reliability, and self-education were not simply moral ideals to him. They were practical strategies capable of producing independence within an uncertain economy. This mindset became one of Franklin's most enduring contributions to American culture. Wealth, in his view, should not exist merely for display. It should create stability, freedom, and the ability to remain useful to society over time. These ideas later spread widely through his writing and became deeply connected to early American attitudes toward labor, productivity, thrift, and self-made success. Franklin's interests gradually expanded beyond business and publishing into broader questions about how cities could organize themselves more effectively. Fires, disease, poor infrastructure, and unreliable communication created constant risks within growing colonial communities. Franklin believed these problems could often be reduced through cooperation, planning, and practical civic organization rather than waiting for distant authorities to intervene. This belief eventually contributed to projects such as volunteer fire brigades, public libraries, and improved communication systems throughout Philadelphia. What made Franklin unusual was not simply his intelligence, but his consistent focus on systems that produced long-term public stability. He understood that strong economies depended on functioning institutions beneath the surface, institutions capable of protecting property, spreading information, and increasing trust between citizens over time. To Franklin, public access to knowledge represented a form of economic infrastructure just as important as roads, ports, or marketplaces. A society filled with informed citizens could adapt more effectively to changing conditions, create better businesses, and participate more intelligently in civic life. This philosophy guided many of the institutions he helped encourage throughout Philadelphia. The idea itself was remarkably modern for its time. Instead of concentrating knowledge entirely among elites, Franklin believed practical education should circulate more broadly throughout society. Shared access to books, discussion, and information could gradually improve not only individuals, but the productivity and stability of entire communities. In this sense, Franklin viewed knowledge as a form of capital capable of generating long-term returns far beyond immediate profit. By his mid-20s, Franklin had developed a far more sophisticated understanding of economic life than most people around him. He no longer viewed wealth simply as money accumulated by individuals. He saw larger patterns connecting communication, labor, public trust, transportation, education, and institutional stability together into a single system. This perspective helped explain why Franklin later became involved in such a wide variety of projects throughout his life. Printing, science, libraries, postal systems, diplomacy, and civic reform may appear unrelated at first glance. But in Franklin's mind, they were deeply connected. Each represented part of a larger effort to improve how information, cooperation, and opportunity moved through society itself. By the middle of his 20s, Benjamin Franklin had already begun seeing Philadelphia differently from most people around him. To many citizens, the city was simply a crowded colonial port filled with merchants, workshops, taverns, laborious and political arguments. But Franklin increasingly viewed it as something larger, a living network of interconnected systems constantly shaping one another beneath the surface of ordinary life. From the rooftops above the narrow streets, he could watch the city awaken each morning in carefully repeated patterns. Merchants prepared shipments before sunrise. Printers organized newspapers for distribution across nearby colonies. Dock workers unloaded cargo arriving from distant ports across the Atlantic world. Bakers, craftsmen, laborious, and clerks each contributed quietly to an expanding economy that depended heavily on timing, communication, trust, and cooperation between strangers. Franklin understood that prosperity rarely emerged from isolated individuals alone. Wealth moved through cities the same way blood moved through the human body, circulating constantly through networks of labor, trade, transportation, and information. If communication failed, commerce slowed. If trust collapsed, credit disappeared. If institutions weakened, entire communities became unstable. These observations deeply shaped Franklin's worldview during the years ahead. Long before modern economists attempted to explain financial systems formally, he had already begun recognizing that strong societies depended not only on money itself, but on invisible structures capable of sustaining public confidence over long periods of time. By his mid-20s, Franklin's role inside Philadelphia was beginning to change noticeably. He was no longer simply a young apprentice learning how systems function from the outside. Increasingly, he had become part of the machinery shaping public conversation itself. Newspapers under his supervision carried political essays, trade information, shipping updates, public notices, and debates capable of influencing how ordinary citizens understood the rapidly changing world around them. Printing during this period was far more than a technical profession. Printers occupied a unique position inside colonial society because they controlled access to communication networks connecting merchants, politicians, intellectuals, and everyday workers across multiple colonies. Franklin understood this clearly. Information moved economies just as reliably as cargo ships moved goods across the Atlantic. Inside rooms like these, he observed how rumors could affect markets, how political tensions influenced trade behavior, and how public confidence often determined whether businesses expanded or quietly collapsed. The longer Franklin worked within these systems, the more convinced he became that communication itself represented a form of infrastructure essential to economic stability. Years later, historians would remember Franklin as an inventor, diplomat, and founding father. But long before any of those roles emerged, he had already become something else. First, a builder of information networks inside one of the fastest-growing commercial societies in the Atlantic world. As Franklin's business responsibilities expanded, so did his understanding of how fragile colonial economies could become when communication and transportation systems failed. Delayed ships affected paper supplies. Poor harvests altered pricing across markets. Political disputes disrupted trade routes between colonies and Britain. Even weather patterns could influence the financial stability of businesses dependent on imported goods. Franklin paid attention to these relationships constantly. To many people, economic instability appeared chaotic and unpredictable. But Franklin increasingly believed patterns existed beneath the surface. Strong institutions, reliable communication, disciplined management, and public trust could reduce uncertainty even during difficult periods. Weak systems, by contrast, allowed fear and disorder to spread quickly through society. This practical understanding separated Franklin from many intellectuals of his time. He rarely approached economics as abstract theory alone. Instead, he understood financial systems through direct observation of everyday life. He saw how laborers depended on merchants, how merchants depended on trade routes, and how trade itself depended heavily on information arriving accurately and on time. In many ways, Franklin's worldview was becoming deeply systemic. He no longer saw cities as collections of isolated individuals pursuing wealth independently. He saw networks, complex structures of cooperation, communication, labor, and incentives holding entire economies together beneath the visible surface of colonial life. Franklin also spent increasing amounts of time reflecting privately on habits, discipline, and the long-term behavior required to build stability in an uncertain world. Colonial society remained volatile in many ways. Businesses failed regularly. Illness spread unpredictably through crowded cities. Political conflicts could alter trade conditions with little warning. Wealth itself often appeared temporary and fragile. Rather than chasing luxury or public status aggressively, Franklin focused on developing systems of personal reliability capable of surviving changing circumstances. He organized his schedule carefully, monitored expenses, studied communication, and treated self-education almost as a lifelong financial investment. To Franklin, discipline was not simply moral behavior. It was practical infrastructure for independence. This philosophy later became deeply connected to the image many Americans associated with Franklin himself. He represented a version of success rooted not in inherited aristocratic privilege, but in usefulness, adaptability, reputation, and steady long-term improvement. These ideas resonated powerfully inside the colonies because they reflected the realities many ordinary people experienced daily. Long before modern self-help literature or economic theory attempted to explain productivity formally, Franklin had already begun developing a distinctly American belief that disciplined habits, accumulated slowly over time, could gradually reshape both individual lives and entire societies. By the end of his 20s, Franklin had become deeply involved in one of the most powerful systems shaping colonial society, the distribution of information itself. Newspapers moved constantly between cities, carrying political arguments, shipping reports, market prices, public announcements, and rumors capable of influencing economic behavior across entire regions. Franklin understood something many people still underestimated during this period. Information did not merely describe society. It actively shaped decisions inside markets, businesses, and governments. A delayed report about trade conditions could influence merchant behavior. News of shortages could trigger price increases. Political uncertainty could alter investment and commerce long before any official policy changed. Because of this, Franklin viewed communication networks almost as economic infrastructure equal in importance to roads, ports, and warehouses. Reliable information reduced uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty encouraged trade. And stable trade created the conditions necessary for long-term prosperity. These ideas would later shape Franklin's involvement with postal reform and public institutions throughout colonial America. But even during these earlier years, the foundations of that thinking were already visible. He believed societies functioned best when knowledge moved efficiently, institutions remained reliable, and ordinary citizens possessed enough information to participate intelligently within economic life itself. As Franklin entered his 30s, his reputation inside Philadelphia continued expanding steadily. He now moved more frequently among merchants, civic leaders, printers, and businessmen whose decisions shaped the financial direction of the colonies themselves. Yet even as his social position improved, Franklin remained unusually observant about the relationship between wealth and public trust. Many successful merchants understood that appearances alone could not sustain prosperity for long. Businesses depended heavily on reputation, reliability, and cooperation between individuals who often possessed very different levels of wealth and influence. Franklin noticed that societies became unstable when trust weakened between these groups. Fear spread quickly through markets where institutions lacked credibility or where information became unreliable. These observations strengthened Franklin's growing belief that healthy economies required more than profit alone. They required systems capable of maintaining confidence over long periods of time. Public trust, disciplined institutions, efficient communication, and predictable rules all contributed to economic stability in ways many political leaders still fail to recognize fully. Franklin's understanding of finance was therefore becoming broader than simple money management. He increasingly viewed economies as psychological systems shaped heavily by human behavior, expectations, incentives, and public confidence, ideas that would later become central to modern economic thinking centuries afterward. Franklin's curiosity during these years expanded far beyond printing and commerce alone. He became increasingly fascinated by science, human behavior, civic organization, and the invisible systems governing everyday life. To Franklin, these subjects were not separate disciplines isolated from one another. They formed interconnected parts of a larger structure shaping how societies functioned over time. This systems-oriented mindset became one of his defining characteristics. Whether studying electricity, postal routes, public libraries, trade networks, or political institutions, Franklin consistently searched for underlying patterns capable of improving efficiency, cooperation, and stability. He believed practical knowledge should produce tangible benefits for society rather than exist purely for intellectual prestige. In many ways, Franklin represented a new kind of thinker emerging during the 18th century. Unlike aristocrats whose status depended primarily on inherited wealth, Franklin's influence came increasingly from usefulness, organization, communication, and problem-solving ability. That distinction mattered enormously inside the rapidly changing world of colonial America. By the early 1730s, Franklin was no longer simply a promising young printer. He was gradually becoming one of the colony's most important builders of systems connecting information, commerce, public trust, and civic life together into the foundations of an emerging American society. As Franklin's influence continued expanding during the early 1730s, his attention increasingly focused on one of the greatest challenges facing the colonies, distance itself. Communication between cities remained slow, inconsistent, and often unreliable. News traveled physically by horse, ship, and messenger across rough roads, unpredictable weather, and fragile transportation systems. Delayed information created uncertainty throughout both commerce and politics. Franklin understood that economies depended heavily on reducing this uncertainty whenever possible. Merchants needed accurate reports about prices and shipments. Printers required timely political updates. Citizens relied on communication networks to understand changing conditions affecting trade, taxes, and public stability. Without reliable information, trust weakened quickly across entire regions. What made Franklin unusual was the way he connected communication directly to economic productivity. He believed societies functioned more efficiently when knowledge circulated rapidly between individuals and institutions. Faster information allowed better decisions. Better decisions reduced waste, panic, and confusion. In many ways, Franklin was beginning to think about infrastructure not simply as roads and buildings, but as systems enabling coordination between human beings on a massive scale. These ideas may sound surprisingly modern today. Yet centuries before telegraphs, telephones, or digital networks existed, Franklin had already recognized a principle that would later define industrial and financial societies across the world. Information itself could become one of the most valuable forms of infrastructure ever created. By this stage of his life, Franklin had also become increasingly familiar with the financial realities facing merchants and business owners throughout the colonies. Trade carried enormous opportunity, but also constant risk. Ships disappeared during storms. Cargo arrived damaged. Political disputes disrupted commercial agreements. Credit systems depended heavily on trust between individuals who often operated across vast geographic distances. Franklin paid close attention to how experienced merchants managed uncertainty. The most successful among them rarely relied on luck alone. They diversified partnerships, protected reputation carefully, maintained disciplined records, and built networks capable of surviving temporary disruptions. Franklin admired this practical stability far more than reckless displays of wealth or speculation. These experiences helped shape his growing understanding of finance itself. To Franklin, wealth was not simply accumulation. It was the ability to create durable systems capable of functioning reliably across time. Stability mattered more than short bursts of profit. Cooperation mattered more than isolated ambition. And credibility often became more valuable than physical currency during moments of economic stress. This philosophy distinguished Franklin from many public figures of his era. He increasingly viewed economic life not as a battlefield where individuals competed endlessly for advantage, but as an interconnected structure where long-term prosperity depended heavily on trust, coordination, and disciplined institutional behavior. Philadelphia itself had become one of Franklin's greatest teachers. The city revealed constantly changing interactions between wealth, labor, communication, public trust, and social mobility unfolding every day across its streets. Merchants negotiated contracts beside laborious unloading cargo. Printers circulated political arguments while craftsmen struggled to maintain stable income during uncertain seasons. Prosperity and hardship existed side by side within the same rapidly expanding urban system. Franklin observed these realities carefully because he understood something many elites still ignored. Economic systems affected ordinary people long before governments formally recognized problems. Rising prices altered household decisions immediately. Delayed wages changed family stability. Poor infrastructure disrupted businesses before political leaders even understood the consequences. The health of society therefore depended not only on powerful individuals, but on the reliability of systems supporting everyday life itself. This perspective helped explain why Franklin consistently focused on practical improvements throughout his career. Better communication networks. Better civic institutions. Better public organization. Better access to information. Better cooperation between citizens. To Franklin, these were not abstract moral ideals. They represented the structural foundations necessary for stable economic growth and long-term public confidence. Years later, Franklin would become internationally famous for diplomacy, science, and politics. But the deeper philosophy shaping all those achievements had already formed much earlier, inside the streets, workshops, markets, and information networks of colonial Philadelphia. By the mid-1730s, Franklin's role inside Philadelphia had evolved far beyond ordinary business ownership. Increasingly, he stood at the intersection of several systems simultaneously: printing, commerce, communication, civic organization, and public opinion. Information passed constantly through his offices in the form of newspapers, shipping notices, political essays, advertisements, and correspondence linking the colonies together through fragile but expanding networks. Franklin understood that influence rarely appeared suddenly or dramatically. More often, it accumulated quietly through reliability and consistent usefulness over long periods of time. People trusted printers who delivered information accurately. Merchants trusted business partners who honored agreements. Citizens trusted institutions that functioned predictably during uncertainty. In Franklin's mind, trust itself gradually became one of the most valuable forms of economic capital any society could possess. This understanding shaped the way he approached nearly every aspect of public life. He believed strong institutions reduced fear and instability because they allowed ordinary people to make decisions with greater confidence about the future. When communication failed, rumors spread rapidly. When institutions weakened, public anxiety often disrupted commerce and cooperation alike. Franklin therefore viewed stability not as passive comfort, but as something actively maintained through disciplined systems and responsible leadership. These ideas would later become deeply connected to the development of American civic culture itself. Long before economists formally studied, Franklin's growing interest in science was deeply connected to the same mindset that shaped his understanding of finance and society. He approached the natural world the way he approached communication systems and economic networks, as structures governed by patterns waiting to be observed carefully and understood rationally. To Franklin, knowledge became most valuable when it produced practical improvement. Scientific inquiry was not merely entertainment for wealthy intellectuals. It represented another method for reducing uncertainty and increasing society's ability to solve problems effectively. This practical philosophy distinguished Franklin from many thinkers of his era who separated intellectual life from everyday economic reality. The same disciplined curiosity that allowed Franklin to study electricity also influenced how he observed human behavior inside markets and institutions. He noticed recurring patterns everywhere. Fear spread quickly during uncertainty. Reliable information stabilized decision-making. Cooperation produced stronger outcomes than isolated competition alone. And systems function best when designed around practical human realities rather than abstract ideals disconnected from everyday life. In many ways, Franklin's broader worldview was becoming increasingly modern. He believed societies improved not through perfect individuals, but through better systems, systems capable of organizing information, incentives, communication, and cooperation more intelligently over time. That belief would later shape not only his scientific work, but also his role in the political and financial development of early America. By his late 30s, Franklin had become one of the most respected and connected figures inside Philadelphia's commercial and intellectual life. Yet despite his growing reputation, he continued viewing society primarily through the lens of systems rather than personal status alone. Standing near the harbor each morning, he could watch the invisible machinery of colonial commerce operating constantly around him. Ships carried far more than cargo into Philadelphia. They transported information, risk, labor, opportunity, and political tension from across the Atlantic world. Markets responded to weather conditions thousands of miles away. Merchants adjusted prices based on distant wars and changing trade policies. local prosperity depended heavily on events occurring far beyond the city itself. Franklin increasingly understood that economies were fragile ecosystems shaped by both visible and invisible forces interacting simultaneously. Public trust, transportation networks, communication systems, legal stability, labor discipline, and international trade all influenced one another continuously. When one part weakened, pressure spread throughout the larger structure. This systemic perspective would later become one of Franklin's greatest strengths during periods of political crisis and institutional uncertainty. Unlike many leaders who focus narrowly on ideology or personal ambition, Franklin consistently searched for ways to preserve coordination between people, institutions, and information systems during moments of instability. In his mind, civilization itself depended on maintaining those connections successfully across time. By the late 1730s, Franklin's understanding of communication had evolved far beyond newspapers and printing alone. Increasingly, he viewed information as something that behaved almost like a living current flowing through society itself. Letters, trade reports, political essays, shipping updates, and public debates moved constantly between colonies along fragile transportation routes that were often slow, expensive, and unreliable. Delayed information created uncertainty everywhere. Merchants hesitated to invest without accurate reports. Political misunderstandings spread quickly between cities separated by long travel times. Even ordinary citizens struggled to understand the larger forces shaping their daily lives. Franklin believed societies functioned more effectively when information moved efficiently between people and institutions. In many ways, he saw communication systems as economic infrastructure just as important as ports, roads, warehouses, or marketplaces. Faster and more reliable information reduced confusion. Reduced confusion encouraged trade, investment, and cooperation. Public trust became easier to maintain when citizens believed systems were functioning predictably around them. What made Franklin unusual was the way he connected these ideas together into a larger philosophy about civilization itself. He increasingly believed stable societies depended not only on wealth or military power, but on the quality of invisible systems operating quietly beneath ordinary life. Communication networks, public trust, reliable institutions, and access to knowledge all strengthened social stability in ways many political leaders still failed to fully understand. Centuries later, historians would describe the rise of information economies and communication infrastructure as defining features of modern civilization. But long before industrialization transformed the world. By the early 1740s, Franklin had become one of the most recognized printers and public thinkers in Philadelphia. Yet much of his influence did not emerge through dramatic speeches or political authority alone. Instead, it spread gradually through printed words entering ordinary homes, shops, taverns, and marketplaces across the colonies. Publications like Poor Richard's Almanac reached people far beyond elite intellectual circles, carrying observations about discipline, labor, money, reputation, and practical living into everyday colonial life. Franklin understood that ideas became most powerful when communicated simply enough for ordinary people to apply them directly. He rarely presented wealth as something mysterious or reserved only for aristocrats. Instead, he described prosperity as the result of habits repeated consistently over long periods of time. Careful spending, useful work, reliability, patience, self-education, cooperation. These principles reflected the realities many colonists faced while trying to survive inside uncertain and rapidly changing economic conditions. What made Franklin's message especially influential was the way it connected morality with practical financial behavior. Wastefulness weakened independence. Discipline created stability. Reputation generated opportunity. To Franklin, economic life was shaped not only by markets and trade, but by the everyday habits individuals practiced quietly over time. Centuries later, many historians would recognize these ideas as part of the foundation of early American middle-class culture. But during Franklin's lifetime, they emerged less as formal theory and more as practical observations drawn from years spent studying how ordinary people navigated uncertainty, ambition, labor, and survival inside the expanding commercial world of colonial America. By the 1740s, Franklin had developed a reputation not only as a printer and writer, but as a careful observer of how ordinary people survived within changing economic conditions. Philadelphia continued expanding rapidly during these years. Markets grew larger. Trade routes became more active. Imported goods circulated more widely through colonial cities connected increasingly by commerce and information. Yet alongside this growth, Franklin also saw widening differences between wealth and hardship unfolding across everyday urban life. Some merchants accumulated influence through trade networks stretching across the Atlantic world, while laborers and apprentices struggled constantly against unstable wages, illness, debt, and unpredictable markets. Franklin understood that prosperity often appeared impressive from a distance while remaining fragile underneath. A poor harvest, delayed shipment, political dispute, or financial panic could quickly destabilize families whose survival depended on steady work and reliable prices. These realities shaped Franklin's growing belief that stable societies required more than economic expansion alone. They required systems capable of reducing unnecessary instability for ordinary citizens. Better communication. Better organization. Better public trust. Better opportunities for practical education and disciplined self-improvement. To Franklin, these were not abstract moral ideas disconnected from economics. They were structural conditions necessary for long-term prosperity. Long before modern governments created large financial institutions or economic safety systems, Franklin was already thinking carefully about how societies could strengthen resilience against uncertainty. In many ways, his ideas reflected an early understanding that economic stability depended not only on wealth creation, but on the reliability of systems supporting everyday life itself. Franklin's influence during these years expanded largely through the written word. Newspapers and printed essays allowed ideas to travel between cities faster than ever before in colonial history. Political arguments, trade discussions, financial concerns, and debates about public responsibility circulated constantly through networks of printers connecting the colonies together. Franklin understood that whoever shaped public conversation also influenced economic behavior beneath the surface. People made financial decisions according to what they believed about the future. Merchants adjusted trade strategies based on rumors and reports. Families changed spending habits during periods of uncertainty. Investors hesitated when political conflict threatened stability. Franklin observed these patterns repeatedly through years spent inside the information systems linking colonial society together. What fascinated him most was how strongly human psychology influenced economic reality. Fear itself could damage markets before actual shortages appeared. Distrust weakened cooperation between businesses and institutions. Public confidence, meanwhile, often stabilized entire systems during uncertain periods. Franklin increasingly viewed trust as a form of invisible currency circulating quietly through society alongside money and trade itself. Centuries later, economists would formally study consumer confidence, information asymmetry, and behavioral finance. But Franklin had already begun recognizing many of these principles simply by observing how communication affected human decision-making inside everyday colonial life. His understanding of economics therefore emerged less from academic theory and more from practical observation of how people behaved under conditions of uncertainty, ambition, fear, and opportunity. As Franklin grew older, he became increasingly convinced that knowledge itself represented one of the most valuable forms of capital any society could possess. Wealth alone could not sustain stable civilizations for long if citizens lacked practical understanding about trade, communication, public responsibility, and cooperation. Ignorance created vulnerability. Poor information weakened decision-making. Distrust slowed economic activity and increased social instability over time. This belief shaped Franklin's continued involvement in libraries, civic organizations, educational projects, and public discussions throughout Philadelphia. He viewed these institutions not merely as cultural achievements for intellectual elites, but as practical systems capable of strengthening society itself. Better informed citizens could participate more effectively in commerce, adapt more intelligently to changing conditions, and contribute more reliably to public stability. Franklin's worldview therefore connected education directly to economics in ways that were unusually modern for the 18th century. He believed societies became stronger when ordinary people gained greater access to useful knowledge rather than remaining dependent entirely on inherited privilege or concentrated authority. Practical education increased independence. Independence encouraged productivity. Productivity strengthened both commerce and civic life simultaneously. These ideas would later influence generations of American thinking about self-improvement, upward mobility, and the relationship between education and economic opportunity. But during Franklin's lifetime, they emerged gradually from years spent observing how information, discipline, trust, and communication quietly shaped the success or failure of entire communities. By the middle of the 18th century, Philadelphia had become one of the most commercially active cities in the colonies, and Franklin stood close enough to observe how deeply international trade influenced everyday life. Ships arriving from Britain and the Caribbean carried far more than physical cargo into the harbor. They brought credit systems, political tensions, market speculation, financial opportunity, and economic risk from across the Atlantic world directly into colonial society. Franklin noticed that commerce depended heavily on confidence operating between people who often never met face to face. Merchants extended credit based on reputation. Traders invested according to incomplete information about distant markets. Entire business networks relied on trust that agreements would eventually be honored across oceans separated by months of travel and dangerous conditions. This constant uncertainty fascinated Franklin because it revealed how fragile economic systems could become when trust weakened. A single failed shipment could damage multiple businesses at once. Rumors about war or political instability could reduce investment before any actual conflict reached the colonies. Fear spread quickly through financial systems because expectations about the future influenced behavior long before reality fully arrived. What Franklin increasingly understood was that economies were shaped not only by material resources, but by collective belief itself. Public confidence influenced trade. Reputation influenced credit. Information influenced investment. In many ways, colonial markets already operated through psychological systems centuries before modern economists formally described them. Franklin's great advantage was his ability to observe these invisible forces quietly while most people remained focused only on visible transactions happening directly in front of them. Franklin spent much of his life thinking carefully about systems that allowed societies to function with greater efficiency and stability. Whether studying electricity, printing newspapers, organizing postal routes, or improving civic institutions, he consistently searched for patterns capable of reducing disorder and increasing coordination between people. He believed human progress depended less on dramatic individual heroism and more on building structures that encouraged cooperation over long periods of time. This mindset also shaped his understanding of wealth itself. Franklin rarely treated money as the ultimate goal of life. Instead, he viewed financial stability as something valuable because it created independence. Independence allowed individuals to think more freely, contribute more effectively to society, and avoid becoming trapped by constant fear or dependency. To Franklin, economic insecurity limited not only comfort, but human potential itself. These ideas became deeply connected to the broader culture emerging inside colonial America during this period. Many ordinary people admired Franklin because he appeared to represent a new kind of success built through discipline, usefulness, and self-education rather than inherited aristocratic privilege alone. His life suggested that practical intelligence and reliable habits could gradually reshape a person's position within society over time. Centuries later, Franklin's image would become almost mythological inside American culture. But during his actual lifetime, his influence grew slowly through years of disciplined work, careful observation, and a remarkably modern understanding of how information, trust, incentives, and institutions quietly shaped economic behavior beneath the surface of everyday life. Walking through Philadelphia during these years, Franklin could observe a society changing rapidly beneath the surface. Colonial cities were becoming larger, wealthier, and more commercially connected than previous generations could have imagined. Trade expanded constantly across the Atlantic world. Information circulated faster through newspapers and postal systems. Opportunities for upward mobility increased for some citizens while economic pressures intensified for others. Franklin understood that growth alone did not guarantee stability. Expanding economies often produced new forms of inequality, speculation, debt, and social tension alongside prosperity itself. Some merchants accumulated significant wealth while the bourse remained vulnerable to illness, unemployment, and rising prices. Political disagreements between colonial governments and British authorities also began creating uncertainty about the future direction of trade and taxation across the empire. These developments strengthened Franklin's belief that societies required strong institutions capable of maintaining cooperation during periods of rapid change. Public trust, reliable communication, practical education, and civic organization all became increasingly important as economic systems grew more complex. Without those stabilizing forces, fear and disorder could spread quickly through expanding markets and densely populated cities. Long before the American Revolution officially began, Franklin was already witnessing the early pressures that would eventually reshape the political and financial future of the colonies. Yet even during these uncertain years, he remained focused on the same fundamental principle that had guided much of his life, that stable civilizations depended on the careful maintenance of systems connecting people, information, commerce, and public trust together across time. By the late 1740s, economic tensions between the colonies and Britain had already begun quietly shaping political conversation throughout cities like Philadelphia. Trade restrictions, taxation concerns, and disputes over currency increasingly affected merchants, printers, and ordinary workers whose livelihoods depended on stable commercial relationships across the Atlantic world. Franklin observed these developments carefully because he understood that financial pressure often transformed societies long before open political conflict officially appeared. Many colonial businesses depended heavily on British trade networks, imported goods, and systems of credit tied directly to London merchants and investors. Yet the colonies themselves continued growing more economically active and increasingly confident in their own commercial abilities. This created a complicated relationship built simultaneously on dependence, ambition, cooperation, and resentment. Franklin recognized that money and political power were deeply connected. Governments shaped markets through taxation, trade policy, and currency regulation. At the same time, financial instability could weaken public trust in political institutions themselves. Merchants frustrated by economic restrictions often became politically dissatisfied long before ordinary citizens fully understood the larger structural tensions developing beneath the surface. These realities fascinated Franklin because they confirmed something he had suspected for years. Economic systems were never purely financial. They were social and psychological systems shaped heavily by trust, incentives, expectations, and public confidence. When large groups of people believed systems no longer operated fairly or predictably, instability spread gradually through both commerce and politics alike. Franklin's position inside the colonial information system gave him a uniquely broad view of how rapidly public opinion could shift during periods of uncertainty. Newspapers carried arguments about taxation, trade, debt, and British authority into homes and businesses across the colonies. Political disagreements that once remained confined to elite circles increasingly entered ordinary daily conversation through printed essays, pamphlets, and public debate. What Franklin understood better than many political leaders was that public confidence could not simply be demanded through authority alone. Trust depended heavily on whether people believed systems were operating fairly and predictably. Merchants wanted stable trade conditions. Workers wanted reliable income and reasonable prices. Citizens wanted institutions capable of protecting opportunity rather than increasing uncertainty unnecessarily. As financial pressures grew, so did suspicion toward distant governments making economic decisions affecting colonial life from across the ocean. Franklin noticed how quickly fear and frustration could spread once people began believing existing systems no longer served their interests effectively. Economic anxiety gradually evolved into political anxiety, and political anxiety began reshaping the emotional relationship between the colonies and Britain itself. These developments reflected patterns Franklin had spent decades studying. Communication influenced behavior. Expectations shaped markets. Public trust stabilized institutions. Fear destabilized them. Long before modern economists described confidence crises or information-driven markets, Franklin had already observed how deeply human psychology influenced the movement of money, power, and political legitimacy throughout society. The colonies were approaching a turning point, although few people yet understood how dramatically the coming decades would reshape the structure of the Atlantic world forever. Standing beside Philadelphia's harbor during these years, Franklin could watch the entire structure of colonial commerce operating before him like a vast living machine connected across oceans and continents. Ships carried manufactured goods from Britain, raw materials from the colonies, financial credit from investors, and political decisions from distant governments, all through the same interconnected trade networks. Wealth flowed constantly through these systems, but so did instability. Franklin increasingly believed that societies became vulnerable whenever economic systems grew too dependent on distant authorities disconnected from local realities. Colonial merchants understood local markets better than officials sitting in London. Farmers understood regional hardships more clearly than distant policymakers reviewing abstract reports across the Atlantic. Yet decisions affecting taxation, trade restrictions, currency, and economic policy often remained concentrated far away from the people living with their consequences directly. This imbalance gradually weakened trust between the colonies and the British system governing them. Economic frustration slowly accumulated beneath ordinary daily life until they began influencing political identity itself. People who once viewed themselves primarily as loyal British subjects increasingly started thinking about local interests, regional independence, and the possibility of greater self-determination within economic life. Franklin observed these shifts carefully because he understood that revolutions rarely begin suddenly. More often, they emerge gradually from long periods of accumulating distrust, financial pressure, institutional rigidity, and communication breakdown between government and citizens. By the time open political conflict finally appears, the deeper emotional and economic fractures have usually existed quietly for many years already. And across the colonies, those fractures were beginning to widen. By the beginning of the 1750s, Franklin had spent decades observing how communication, commerce, public trust, and political power influenced one another beneath the surface of colonial society. What he increasingly recognized was that financial systems alone could not maintain stability indefinitely if large portions of the population began losing confidence in the fairness of institutions governing them. The British Empire remained one of the most powerful commercial systems in the world during this period. Its trade networks connected continents, moved enormous quantities of goods across oceans, and generated immense wealth for merchants, investors, and political elites. Yet within the colonies, many citizens increasingly felt trapped inside economic structures shaped by distant authorities who often failed to understand local realities. Franklin saw these frustrations emerging not only through political debate, but through ordinary financial behavior. Merchants hesitated under changing regulations. Printers published growing criticism about taxation and currency restrictions. Workers worried about unstable prices and declining opportunity. Economic anxiety slowly transformed into emotional distance between the colonies and Britain itself. What made Franklin especially important during this era was his ability to interpret these tensions systemically rather than emotionally. He understood that societies weakened when communication between governments and citizens deteriorated over long periods of time. Policies imposed without trust often created resistance rather than stability. Financial pressure, when combined with public resentment, gradually destabilized even powerful institutions. Beneath the surface, the invisible systems connecting cooperation, political legitimacy, and economic confidence were beginning to weaken. As tensions between European powers expanded across North America, Franklin became increasingly involved in discussions about colonial coordination and long-term political organization. Events such as the Albany Congress revealed how fragmented the colonies still remained despite their growing economic interdependence. Each colony protected its own interests, trade systems, and political priorities, often struggling to cooperate effectively even when facing shared external threats. Franklin viewed this lack of coordination as both a political and economic weakness. Trade networks already connected the colonies through commerce, transportation, newspapers, and communication systems. Yet politically, they remained divided and inefficient. Franklin believed stronger cooperation could improve defense, reduce instability, and create more reliable structures for managing collective problems across the colonies. His famous proposals for colonial unity reflected the same systems-oriented mindset that shaped much of his life. Franklin consistently searched for ways to organize human activity more efficiently through better communication, stronger institutions, and clearer coordination between groups with shared interests. To him, stable systems reduced uncertainty and increased resilience during periods of crisis. At the same time, Franklin remained realistic about the challenges involved. Different colonies possessed competing economic interests, religious differences, regional rivalries, and varying relationships with British authority. Cooperation sounded reasonable in theory, but implementing it required trust between populations that often viewed one another with suspicion. Still, Franklin increasingly believed that the future stability of the colonies might eventually depend on their ability to function less like isolated settlements and more like interconnected parts of a larger political and economic system. During the 1750s, Franklin watched public conversation throughout the colonies become increasingly shaped by questions of power, taxation, trade, debt, and political representation. Newspapers and pamphlets spread these debates rapidly between cities, allowing ideas to circulate far more widely than earlier generations could have imagined. What once remained local frustrations gradually evolved into broader discussions about the future relationship between the colonies and British authority. Franklin understood that economic pressure often transformed public psychology before political systems fully recognized the danger. People tolerated hardship more easily when they believed institutions were functioning fairly and predictably. But when citizens began suspecting that systems primarily benefited distant elites while increasing uncertainty for ordinary communities, resentment accumulated quietly beneath everyday life. He had spent decades studying how information influenced behavior inside markets and societies. Fear altered investment decisions. Distrust weakened cooperation. Rumors spread instability faster than facts. The same patterns now appeared increasingly visible within colonial politics itself. Economic anxiety was slowly reshaping how people emotionally understood their place inside the empire. What made this period especially dangerous was the growing gap between how British authorities viewed the colonies and how colonists viewed themselves. London still largely saw America as a network of territory supporting imperial trade and revenue. But many colonists increasingly viewed themselves as economically capable societies deserving greater influence over decisions shaping their own future. Franklin stood directly between these worlds, observing both sides carefully while recognizing that communication failures, financial tension, and declining trust were steadily pushing the Atlantic system toward a crisis few people yet fully understood. Franklin's later travels to Britain exposed him even more directly to the enormous financial machinery supporting the British Empire during the 18th century. London operated unlike anything most colonists had ever seen before. Banks, insurers, shipping firms, government offices, merchants, and investors all functioned together inside a dense commercial system powered by trade flowing across multiple continents. For Franklin, the experience reinforced how deeply economic power depended on organization and information rather than simple physical wealth alone. Credit systems connected strangers who would never meet personally. Financial decisions made in London influenced prices, trade opportunities, and political conditions thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. Entire industries depended on confidence that institutions would continue functioning predictably despite war, distance, and uncertainty. Yet Franklin also noticed growing weaknesses hidden beneath the empire's immense scale. British political leaders often misunderstood colonial realities while focusing heavily on debt, taxation, and imperial control following years of expensive military conflict. Economic pressure increasingly shaped imperial policy, even when those decisions weakened trust between Britain and the colonies themselves. What concerned Franklin most was not disagreement alone, but the gradual breakdown of mutual understanding between distant systems attempting to govern one another. Communication delays, conflicting economic interests, and political pride all made cooperation more fragile over time. The empire still appeared powerful on the surface, but Franklin increasingly sensed that important structural relationships beneath it were beginning to strain under pressure. As debates about taxation and colonial authority intensified during the 1760s, Franklin found himself positioned between two worlds increasingly struggling to understand one another. British officials viewed the colonies largely through the lens of imperial finance. Wars against European rivals had created enormous national debt, and many leaders believed the colonies should contribute more directly toward maintaining the empire that protected them. From the colonial perspective, however, the issue felt far more personal and immediate. Merchants feared unstable trade conditions. Printers criticized expanding political control. Ordinary citizens worried about rising costs and declining economic independence. Franklin understood both sides well enough to recognize the deeper danger forming beneath the surface. The crisis was no longer only about taxes themselves. It was becoming a crisis of trust. Colonists increasingly believed distant authorities were making financial decisions without understanding local realities. British officials, meanwhile, often viewed colonial resistance as irrational ingratitude rather than a warning sign of weakening legitimacy. Franklin had spent decades studying how economic systems depended heavily on confidence, communication, and cooperation between institutions and ordinary people. The same patterns now appeared clearly within imperial politics itself. Once populations began doubting whether systems operated fairly, resistance spread faster than governments could easily control. Long before open revolution fully erupted, Franklin could already see that the emotional bond connecting Britain and the colonies was beginning to fracture under the combined pressure of debt, taxation, distance, and declining trust. By the mid-1760s, Franklin understood that the Atlantic world was entering a period of profound instability. Economic pressure, political distrust, communication breakdowns, and competing visions of authority were slowly reshaping the relationship between Britain and the colonies in ways that could no longer be easily repaired. For decades, Franklin had believed cooperation between institutions and citizens formed the foundation of stable societies. Strong systems reduced uncertainty. Reliable communication maintained trust. Fair economic conditions encouraged productivity and long-term investment in the future. But increasingly, those stabilizing forces were beginning to weaken across the empire itself. The British government needed revenue to manage debt and maintain imperial power. The colonies demanded greater influence over decisions affecting their economic lives directly. Merchants feared disruption to trade. Ordinary workers worried about rising prices and declining opportunity. Political arguments spread constantly through newspapers, taverns, ports, and marketplaces connected by expanding information networks Franklin himself had helped strengthen throughout his career. What made the situation especially dangerous was the way financial anxiety gradually transformed into political identity. Colonists no longer argued only about taxes or trade regulations. Increasingly, they questioned whether distant governments truly understood or represented their interests at all. Franklin had spent most of his life studying systems quietly operating beneath society, communication, trust, incentives, institutions, and economic behavior. Now, for the first time, he was watching many of those same systems begin moving toward open fracture across the Atlantic world itself. During the years leading toward revolution, taverns, coffee houses, print shops, and public meeting rooms became some of the most important communication centers in colonial society. Newspapers circulated arguments about taxation, representation, debt, and imperial authority faster than ever before. Ordinary citizens who once remained distant from political affairs increasingly discussed financial policy and government power as part of daily life. Franklin understood that these conversations mattered far beyond politics alone. Public emotion itself was beginning to reshape economic behavior across the colonies. Merchants hesitated before making long-term investments. Trade relationships became more fragile during periods of uncertainty. Fear of instability altered spending habits, borrowing decisions, and business confidence long before official conflict openly appeared. What Franklin recognized more clearly than many leaders of his era was that systems weakened gradually before they collapsed visibly. Distrust accumulated quietly through repeated experiences where populations felt ignored, misunderstood, or economically pressured by distant institutions. Over time, even relatively small policies could generate enormous emotional reactions once confidence began deteriorating beneath the surface. The colonies and Britain still remained connected through trade, culture, law, and shared history. Yet psychologically, separation had already begun. Increasingly, colonists viewed economic dependence itself as a form of vulnerability. Printing presses played a powerful role during the revolutionary period because they allowed ideas to travel faster than governments could easily control. Political essays, pamphlets, speeches, and newspaper reports connected separate colonies into a shared emotional and intellectual conversation about power, economics, and legitimacy. Franklin understood this transformation deeply because he had spent most of his life inside the information systems making it possible. For decades, he had observed how communication influenced markets, public confidence, and institutional stability. Now those same mechanisms were influencing revolutionary politics itself. A single pamphlet could reshape public opinion across multiple cities. Reports about taxation or British military action spread rapidly through ports, taverns, and marketplaces already filled with economic anxiety and political frustration. Franklin increasingly recognized that revolutions often begin inside perception before they fully appear in physical reality. Once enough people believe systems are unfair, unstable, or unresponsive to their concerns, legitimacy begins weakening from within. Financial pressure accelerates this process because economic hardship affects ordinary daily life directly and emotionally. What made the colonial crisis especially dangerous was the combination of political disagreement with expanding communication networks. Earlier generations might have remained isolated by geography and slow information flow. But now newspapers and printed arguments connected distant populations into a much larger collective identity shaped increasingly by shared resentment and shared economic fears. The empire still possessed military strength and financial power. But Franklin understood something many leaders overlooked. No system remains stable indefinitely once large portions of the population stop trusting the institutions governing them. As tensions between Britain and the colonies intensified, Franklin increasingly found himself traveling between political worlds attempting to prevent complete collapse in the relationship he had spent much of his life trying to strengthen. He understood both colonial frustrations and British financial concerns more deeply than most public figures on either side of the Atlantic. Britain faced enormous debt following years of expensive warfare and imperial expansion. Political leaders believed stronger taxation and tighter control over colonial trade were necessary for maintaining stability across the empire. From London's perspective, these measures appeared financially rational. But Franklin understood that economic systems could not function through mathematics alone. Human trust mattered equally. Colonists increasingly believed distant authorities cared more about extracting revenue than maintaining fair partnership. Economic pressure therefore became emotional pressure. Financial regulation became symbolic of political disrespect and declining autonomy. Franklin repeatedly warned British officials that policies imposed without public trust would eventually create resistance far larger than the taxes themselves. His warnings reflected decades of observing how communication, incentives, and psychology shape both markets and political systems. People cooperated most effectively when they believed institutions operated fairly and predictably. Once populations lost confidence in that fairness, fear and resentment spread rapidly through society, weakening stability from within. By the late 1760s, Franklin could already sense that the Atlantic system connecting Britain and the colonies was approaching a point where distrust itself might become impossible to reverse. Franklin increasingly understood that empires were sustained not only through armies or kings, but through vast administrative systems operating quietly behind the surface of public life. Ledgers tracked debt. Shipping records monitored trade. Tax systems attempted to organize revenue flowing across continents. Governments relied on enormous networks of paperwork, communication, and financial coordination to maintain authority over distant populations. To many ordinary citizens, these systems remained invisible. People experienced only the consequences: higher prices, trade restrictions, changing laws, or economic uncertainty affecting daily survival. But Franklin had spent enough years inside printing, commerce, and political negotiation to recognize how deeply modern societies depended on administrative structures most people rarely noticed directly. What concerned him increasingly was the growing distance between decision-makers and the realities experienced by ordinary colonists. Large systems became fragile when information moved too slowly between rulers and citizens. Misunderstanding accumulated. Distrust spread. Policies designed for financial efficiency often produced emotional resentment instead. Franklin understood that institutions functioned best when populations believed systems still reflected their interests fairly. Once that belief weakened, authority itself gradually became unstable regardless of military or financial strength. Across the Atlantic world, he could already sense those invisible fractures widening beneath the surface of empire itself. For much of his life, Franklin had watched the Atlantic world become increasingly interconnected through trade, information, debt, and political power flowing constantly between continents. Ships crossing the ocean carried far more than physical goods alone. They transported financial expectations, political decisions, rumors, ambitions, fears, and entire systems of economic dependency linking ordinary colonial lives to distant imperial institutions. What fascinated Franklin most was how invisible these connections often appeared to people living inside them. A merchant in Philadelphia might depend on credit originating in London. Farmers relied on pricing influenced by European markets they would never personally see. Political arguments published in colonial newspapers could alter investment decisions across entire ports thousands of miles away. Franklin increasingly viewed civilization itself as a network of interdependent systems held together by communication and public trust. When those connections functioned smoothly, societies appeared stable and prosperous. But once distrust entered the system, instability spread rapidly across networks that had become deeply interconnected over decades. In many ways, Franklin's understanding of the world had become remarkably modern. Long before globalization became a common concept, he already recognized that distant financial decisions, political tensions, and communication breakdowns could reshape local economic life almost everywhere simultaneously. The Atlantic world was becoming one enormous interconnected system, and Franklin sensed that system moving steadily toward crisis. By the early 1770s, Franklin understood that economic systems could unravel psychologically long before they collapsed physically. Financial panic rarely began with empty warehouses or vanished resources alone. More often, instability emerged when confidence disappeared between governments, merchants, institutions, and ordinary citizens all at once. Trade slowed when uncertainty increased. Credit weakened when trust deteriorated. Investments disappeared when people feared unpredictable political conditions. Franklin had spent decades studying these patterns quietly through commerce, printing, diplomacy, and public life. Now he watched many of those same forces spreading simultaneously across the Atlantic system itself. What made the situation especially dangerous was that both Britain and the colonies increasingly interpreted one another through suspicion rather than cooperation. Economic pressure created political resentment. Political resentment weakened trust. Weakening trust then produced even greater instability inside markets and institutions already under strain. Franklin recognized that civilizations depended heavily on invisible emotional foundations most people rarely discussed openly. Confidence, legitimacy, cooperation, shared belief in the future. Once those foundations weakened, even wealthy and powerful systems could begin deteriorating surprisingly quickly beneath the surface. For years, Franklin had hoped communication and negotiation might preserve stability between Britain and the colonies. But by this period, he increasingly sensed that distrust itself had become one of the most powerful forces shaping the future of the Atlantic world. Standing above Philadelphia during the years before Revolution, Franklin could observe a society suspended between stability and transformation. The streets below still appeared familiar. Merchants continued trading. Ships still entered the harbor. Printers produced newspapers each morning while ordinary citizens worked, negotiated, borrowed, and planned for the future much as they always had. Yet beneath that outward normality, something fundamental had already begun changing. More colonists now questioned whether existing systems truly represented their interests. Economic frustrations gradually evolved into broader doubts about political legitimacy, institutional fairness, and the future direction of society itself. Franklin understood these changes deeply because he had spent much of his life studying how invisible systems shaped human behavior beneath the surface of ordinary life. Trust encouraged cooperation. Cooperation created prosperity. But once distrust spread widely enough, even stable systems could begin weakening quietly from within. What made revolutions especially dangerous was that they rarely unfolded only through battles or political speeches. They emerged psychologically first. People stopped believing the future would resemble the past. Existing institutions no longer felt permanent. Old assumptions about authority weakened slowly until societies crossed invisible thresholds that became impossible to reverse completely. Franklin sensed the colonies approaching that threshold now. For decades, he had worked to strengthen communication, civic organization, and public trust across society. But increasingly, the Atlantic world itself seemed unable to maintain the cooperation that had once held the empire together. As revolution moved from political tension into open conflict, Franklin eventually became one of the most important diplomatic figures representing the American cause abroad. In France, he entered a world shaped heavily by aristocratic wealth, imperial rivalry, financial ambition, and delicate political negotiation between competing European powers. Franklin understood that wars were sustained not only through armies and ideals, but through credit, international trust, and financial support capable of maintaining long-term stability during uncertainty. The colonies lacked many of the resources necessary to survive independently against Britain without foreign assistance. Diplomacy therefore became deeply connected to economics itself. What made Franklin especially effective in France was his understanding of perception and legitimacy. Nations invested in alliances much like merchants invested in trade relationships. Confidence mattered. Reputation mattered. Foreign governments needed to believe the American experiment possessed enough stability and long-term potential to justify enormous financial and military risk. For decades, Franklin had studied how communication influenced trust inside markets and institutions. Now he applied many of those same principles internationally. He understood that persuasion often depended less on force than on credibility, patience, symbolism, and the careful management of public confidence between powerful systems. The revolutionary struggle was no longer simply colonial rebellion. It had become part of a much larger contest involving global finance, imperial competition, and the future balance of power across the Atlantic world itself. By the later years of his life, Franklin had witnessed extraordinary transformations reshaping the Atlantic world. He had watched small colonial settlements evolve into expanding commercial societies connected through trade, printing, communication networks, and increasingly complex financial systems. He had also watched those same systems fracture under the pressure of debt, distrust, political rigidity, and competing visions of power. What remained remarkable about Franklin was not simply his intelligence, but the consistency of his worldview across decades of enormous change. He believed societies functioned best when information moved openly, institutions maintained public trust, and ordinary people possessed opportunities to improve their lives through discipline, education, and cooperation. Again and again, Franklin returned to the same fundamental insight. Stable civilizations depended not only on wealth or military strength, but on invisible systems shaping human behavior beneath the surface of daily life. Communication, reputation, confidence, incentives, public trust. These forces often determined the success or failure of societies long before visible collapse or prosperity fully appeared. In many ways, Franklin spent his entire life studying how human beings organized themselves under conditions of uncertainty. Whether through printing, diplomacy, science, finance, or civic reform, he searched constantly for systems capable of reducing fear and increasing cooperation across increasingly interconnected societies. And as the modern world slowly emerged around him, Franklin understood perhaps earlier than most, that information itself would become one of the most powerful forces shaping the future of civilization. As night settled across the later years of Benjamin Franklin's life, the world around him had already changed beyond what most people born in colonial America could have imagined. Empires had fractured. Revolutions had reshaped political power. Financial systems had expanded across oceans connecting distant societies through trade, debt, communication, and increasingly complex networks of human cooperation. Yet beneath all those historic transformations, Franklin continued returning to the same quiet realization he had spent decades observing throughout his life. Civilization itself depended less on isolated individuals than on invisible systems linking human beings together across time. Trust allowed commerce to function. Communication allowed societies to coordinate. Shared belief in institutions allowed millions of strangers to cooperate without ever fully knowing one another personally. Franklin understood that these systems remained fragile precisely because they depended so heavily on human behavior itself. Fear could destabilize markets. Distrust could weaken governments. Poor communication could fracture societies already under strain. But the opposite was also true. Reliable information strengthened confidence. Fair institutions encouraged stability. Cooperation created possibilities no isolated individual could ever achieve alone. In many ways, Franklin's greatest contribution was not a single invention, political office, or diplomatic victory. It was his unusually modern understanding that information, incentives, public trust, and human psychology quietly shaped the destiny of civilizations beneath the visible surface of history itself. And as candlelight continued glowing softly inside homes, libraries, workshops, and cities shaped by the systems he helped build, the ideas Franklin spent his life studying would continue moving silently through the modern world long after he was gone.